The last thing my husband Richard asked of me on his deathbed was, "Please, Evelyn, promise me you'll never go to Magnolia Ridge." His eyes, once bright and full of life, now clouded with pain, held mine with an intensity I'd never seen before. He squeezed my hand with the last remnants of strength he possessed. In that moment, I promised him without hesitation, as I had honored his wishes throughout our 40 years of marriage. But curiosity has always been my greatest flaw, and now 2 years after his passing, that curiosity consumed me day and night. I never understood why Rid was so adamant about keeping me away from this property, whose existence I barely knew of through casual mentions over the years. The few times I tried to inquire about it, he would change the subject with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Some places are better left unvisited, my love," he would always say, and I, respecting his privacy as he respected mine, never pressed the issue. How could I have imagined, then, that what I would discover in that house would change my life forever? My story truly begins on a rainy Tuesday in November, 2 years after Richard's passing. Those first months without him had been a hell of loneliness and grief. At 65, I found myself lost in a house too large, with too many memories and an overwhelming silence that no radio station could fill. Our children Sarah and Michael lived far away with their own families, and although they visited regularly, their lives moved forward while mine seemed to have stopped with Richard's last breath. That day, the phone rang as I was watering my orchids, the only passion I had kept alive since Richard's death. It was Thomas Hamilton, my late husband's attorney. "Mrs. Evelyn Bennett, I'm sorry to disturb you," he said with his formal voice. "But there's a pending matter that your husband asked me to address with you exactly 2 years after his passing. Could you come to my office tomorrow?" Curiosity immediately flooded through me. "What is this about, Thomas? It's been 2 years. What could possibly remain unsettled?" "I prefer to discuss it in person, Mrs. Bennett. Those are the specific instructions your husband left." The next day, I found myself in front of the elegant building, where Thomas had his law firm in downtown Boston. I wore my best suit, the same one I had worn at the last anniversary Richard and I had celebrated together. I felt nervous, as if I were about to meet a long-lost lover. Thomas greeted me with a kind but reserved smile. On his mahogany desk sat a metal box with my name engraved on it, and a sealed envelope. My heart pounded as I took a seat. "Mrs. Bennett," Thomas began, "your husband left very precise instructions. This box and this envelope were to be given to you exactly 2 years after his departure. He asked me to respect this time frame without exception." I stared at the box, feeling a lump in my throat. "Why wait 2 years?" Mr. Bennett said, "You would need that time to process your grief before confronting whatever is in that box." With trembling hands, I took the envelope first. Upon opening it, I immediately recognized Richard's neat handwriting. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means 2 years have passed since I left you. I hope time has softened the pain of my departure, though I know it will never completely disappear, just as the pain I felt when we lost our little William never truly faded. There's something I never told you, my love. Something I kept secret, not from a lack of trust, but from a desire to protect you. Magnolia Ridge, that property I asked you never to visit, now belongs to you. In the box you'll find the keys and all documents proving your ownership. I made you promise never to go there, because I wanted to spare you unnecessary pain, but now I release you from that promise. In fact, I ask you to go, to see what I have created there. I only ask that you go alone the first time. I have loved you every day of our life together, even in those difficult moments when pain separated us. Perhaps now, after my departure, you can understand why I kept this secret. Always yours, Richard." Tears blurred my vision as I read his words over and over. What secret had my husband guarded so carefully? What could be in that house that he considered too painful for me? I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside I found a set of antique keys, a property deed, and a detailed map showing how to reach Magnolia Ridge, located in a small town in the Berkshires, just over 2 hours from Boston. The property is fully paid for and all taxes are up to date, explained Thomas. Mr. Bennett made sure you wouldn't have to worry about anything. Do you know what's there? I asked, still bewildered. Thomas shook his head. I only went once to sign the purchase documents. It was an old country house that needed renovation, but that was almost 10 years ago. I haven't been back since. 10 years? 10 years during which my husband had kept the existence of this property a secret. 10 years of business trips that might not have been business at all. I felt a pang of pain. Was there another woman? Another family? No, I refused to believe it. Richard had never given me any reason to doubt his fidelity. I left Thomas's office with the box and 1,000 unanswered questions. For 3 days, the keys to Magnolia Ridge remained on my nightstand, calling to me, tempting me, like the forbidden fruit. Finally, on a sunny November morning, I made a decision. It was time to discover what secret Richard had guarded so carefully. Without telling anyone, not even my children, I packed a small suitcase with essentials and set off. The drive through the Berkshires was beautiful, with the autumn landscape displaying a spectacular show of colors that I would have admired under different circumstances. But my mind was fixed on what I would find at the end of the road. After almost 2 hours of driving, following the detailed map Richard had left, I arrived at a small town that seemed frozen in time. Stone houses with slate roofs, a century-old church, elderly people sitting in the town square, enjoying the morning sun. Continuing down a dirt road that led into the woods, I finally saw it. Magnolia Ridge was much more imposing than I had imagined. A beautiful 2-story mansion built of stone and wood, with a slate roof and large windows. It was surrounded by an extensive garden, where magnificent magnolias grew alongside other perfectly maintained trees and shrubs. The property was enclosed by a low stone wall, with a wrought iron gate displaying the name Magnolia Ridge in elegant letters. My heart was racing as I parked the car in front of the entrance. With trembling hands, I took the keys and headed towards the gate. The largest key fit perfectly into the lock, which turned with a satisfying click. The gravel path leading to the main entrance was immaculate, without a single fallen leaf despite the season. As I approached the main door, I noticed something strange. The house didn't seem abandoned at all. The windows were clean. The flower pots on the porch contained fresh flowers, and there was no trace of the deterioration one would expect in an unoccupied property. Was someone living here? Was this the terrible truth that Richard wanted to hide from me? With my heart in my throat, I inserted the key into the main door. As I opened it, the aroma hit me like a wave. Magnolias, polished wood, and something else, a familiar perfume I couldn't quite identify. I took a step inside and froze. The foyer opened into a spacious living room, with high ceilings and exposed wooden beams. Light poured in through the large windows, illuminating what looked like an art gallery. On every wall, in every available space, there were paintings of orchids, hundreds of them, of all species and imaginable colors, painted with exquisite detail and love. I approached one of the paintings with trembling steps. In the lower corner, I recognized the signature, R.B. Richard Bennett, my husband. Never in our 40 years together had I seen him paint, or even draw, or had. Suddenly, I remembered how in the early years of our marriage before the children were born, I would sometimes catch him scribbling in his notebook. When I asked, he would always say they were just work notes. In the center of the room, on an antique table, was a photo album and an envelope with my name. I sat on the nearby sofa, feeling my legs might not support me much longer. I opened the envelope and found another letter from Richard. My dear Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means you've decided to visit Magnolia Ridge, despite my request. I can't blame you. Curiosity has always been one of your most endearing qualities. This house and everything it contains is my gift to you. For the past 10 years, I've come here during my supposed business trips to create something special, something I could leave you when I was no longer by your side. The paintings you see are my tribute to your love for orchids. I never had the courage to show you my paintings. I feared they wouldn't be good enough in your eyes. But here in this place I could express my love for you through the art I secretly admired. There is much more to discover in this house, my love. Take your time. Explore every room, every corner, and when you're ready, go to the greenhouse behind the house. There, you'll find the reason why I asked you never to come here while I was alive. With all my love, Richard. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks as I held the letter. There was no other woman, no betrayal, just my Richard, secretly creating this sanctuary of beauty for me. But then, why had he asked me never to come? What secret did the greenhouse hold that he mentioned? I spent hours exploring the house, discovering more and more treasures. Each room had a different theme, but all were connected by the orchid motif. The kitchen was modern and fully equipped. The pantry was stocked with non-perishable foods, as if Richard had expected my visit at any time. The library contained hundreds of books, many on botany and specifically on orchids, my secret passion that I had never fully developed due to family obligations. Upstairs I found 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom was an almost exact replica of our bedroom in Boston, down to the last detail, including a photograph of us as a young couple, on the nightstand. The other 2 were prepared as if awaiting visitors, perhaps for our children and their families. But what truly took my breath away was the room at the end of the hallway. Opening the door, I found myself in a fully equipped art studio. Easels, blank canvases, paints, brushes, everything an artist could desire, and on the walls, sketches and preliminary studies of the orchids that adorned the rest of the house. This was where Richard had developed his hidden talent, where he had spent countless hours creating beauty for me. The sun was beginning to set when I finally headed to the back of the house. Through the dining room windows, I could see the greenhouse Richard mentioned in his letter. It was an elegant structure of iron and glass, much larger than I had imagined. I took a deep breath before stepping into the garden. What secret awaited me there? What could be so painful that Richard wanted to protect me from it until after his death? The stone path leading to the greenhouse was bordered by carefully pruned rose bushes. As I approached, I could see that the interior of the greenhouse glowed with a soft golden light. The glass door opened with a slight creak, and the scent immediately enveloped me. Flowering orchids, moist soil, and that familiar perfume I had noticed earlier. What I saw inside brought me to my knees. The greenhouse was a tropical paradise, with hundreds of orchids of every imaginable variety, blooming in glorious abundance. But what took my breath away was the center of the space. There in a raised area, surrounded by the most lush flowers, stood a small white marble monument, and engraved on it, a name I hadn't spoken aloud in over 30 years, William Bennett, our angel, forever in our hearts. William, our first child, who lived only 3 days. The pain of his loss nearly destroyed our marriage. Richard and I dealt with the tragedy in different ways. I immersed myself in public, heartbreaking grief, while he enclosed himself in a stoic silence that I mistook for coldness. Eventually we overcame that darkness and were blessed with Sarah and Michael. But we never spoke of William again. It was too deep a pain, a wound that never completely healed. And now, I discovered that for 10 years, Richard had been building this sanctuary for our lost son, for William, and for me. I approached the monument, caressing the name engraved in the cold marble. Next to it was another letter protected in a glass box. My beloved Evelyn, now you understand why I asked you not to come here. I feared this place would reopen wounds that never fully healed. But I also know that you needed this, as much as I needed it. We never could give William a proper place to rest, a place where we could honor his brief existence. This is my attempt to correct that. No, his remains aren't here. I respect the law and your feelings too much to do something like that, but his spirit is here, in every orchid that blooms, in every ray of sunlight that passes through the glass. I've spent the last years of my life creating this refuge, this place where pain transforms into beauty. Each orchid was chosen and cultivated with love, each painting created with the memory of your face when you look at the flowers you love so much. I ask your forgiveness for keeping this secret, for not sharing my grief with you as I should have. But I hope this place brings you peace as it brought me peace. Magnolia Ridge is yours now. You can come here to find comfort, to remember not only the pain of loss, but also the beauty that emerged from it. Our children, our grandchildren, our life together. I will love you forever. Richard. Tears clouded my vision as I held the letter against my chest. How could I have missed this side of Richard? How had I not seen the pain he still carried, the silent grief he had borne all these years? Sitting there, among the orchids he had cultivated with such love, I felt a part of myself transform. The pain of Richard's loss, now mingled with a new understanding of who he had really been, of the deep and unbreakable love he felt for me and for our lost son. When the sun had completely set, I rose and returned to the house. Feeling strangely at peace, I made myself a cup of tea in the kitchen Richard had designed with me in mind, and sat on the living room couch, surrounded by his paintings. I planned to spend the night there, in this sanctuary my husband had created for us. What I didn't know then was that this night would mark only the beginning of my relationship with Magnolia Ridge, and that very soon, the refuge Richard had built with such love would become the center of a battle I never imagined I would have to fight. The sound of tires on gravel woke me early the next morning. I had fallen asleep on the couch, surrounded by Richard's orchid paintings. Disoriented, I sat up and looked out the window. A black car, elegant and obviously expensive, had stopped in front of the house. 3 men in expensive suits descended from the vehicle, 2 middle-aged and 1 older, all with an unmistakable air of authority and wealth. My heart raced. Who were they? What did they want? Had Richard left some pending debt related to the property? I quickly fixed my hair and my wrinkled clothes, cursing myself for not changing before falling asleep. The doorbell rang, imperious and demanding. I took a deep breath and headed to the door, unsure of what awaited me. Upon opening it, I found myself facing 3 pairs of eyes examining me with cold calculation. "Good morning," said the oldest. A man in his 70s with silver hair and eyes that uncomfortably reminded me of someone. "You must be Evelyn Bennett, Richard's widow." "Yes, that's me," I replied, keeping the door partially open. "And you are?" "Allow me to introduce ourselves," he continued with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Howard Bennett. These are my sons, Carter and Edward. We are Richard's family." Richard's family. The shock left me momentarily speechless. In 40 years of marriage, Richard had never mentioned his family, except to say he had none. He had told me he was an only child and that his parents had died before we met. Had it all been a lie? "Excuse me," I finally managed to say, but Richard never mentioned having brothers or nephews. Howard let out a dry laugh. "I'm not surprised. My brother was always expert at erasing the parts of his life he found inconvenient. May we come in? This conversation would be more appropriate inside the family home, don't you think?" Brother? Family home? My mind was spinning as, almost automatically, I stepped aside to let them in. The 3 men walked past me with the confidence of those who feel they own the place. "I see Richard finally finished the renovations," Howard commented, looking around with a critical eye. "At least he had the decency to properly restore the family heritage before appropriating it." "Excuse me," I interrupted, regaining some composure. "But this house legally belongs to my husband. He left it to me in his will." Carter, the older of the 2 sons, snorted with disdain. "This property has belonged to the Bennett family for 5 generations, ma'am. My uncle simply, temporarily borrowed the property title." "What my son is trying to say," Howard intervened with a condescending tone, "is that there was some confusion with the property documents years ago. Richard took advantage of a legal technicality while I was ill. But now we're here to correct that misunderstanding." Edward, the youngest and so far silent, approached one of the orchid paintings. "Interesting. I didn't know my uncle had such a Hobby. These might be worth something in the right market. Something in his tone, in the way his eyes assessed the paintings as merchandise, ignited a spark of indignation in me. I'd appreciate it if you would explain exactly what you want, I said, with more firmness than I felt. This property legally belongs to me. I have all the documents to prove it. Howard sat on the sofa, as if he were the host and not the guest. You see, Mrs. Bennet, the situation is simple. This property should never have left the Bennet family. Richard acquired it at a time when I was indisposed. Now that he has passed away, it's only fair that it returns to its rightful owners. And those would be you? I asked, feeling my irritation grow. Of course, he replied with a wolfish smile. We're prepared to be generous. We'll offer you reasonable compensation for any investments Richard made in the property. You can take your personal belongings, of course. This house and everything in it belongs to me, I insisted. My husband bought it legally and left it to me. I have no intention of selling it. The three men exchanged glances as if my answer was exactly what they expected. Mrs. Bennet, Carter said, with false kindness, we understand this must be difficult for you. Losing a husband, discovering secrets he kept hidden, it must be overwhelming. That's why we want to do this in the friendliest way possible. Secrets? I repeated, feeling a chill. What exactly are you referring to? Edward pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the coffee table. You might want to review this before making hasty decisions. They're copies, of course. The originals are in safekeeping. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs and documents dating back more than 40 years. In the photos, I saw a young Richard, unrecognizable with his long, rebellious hair, participating in what appeared to be political demonstrations. The documents seemed to be police reports and newspaper clippings, linking him to radical groups during the Vietnam War era. What does this mean? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the implicit threat. It means your dear husband wasn't who you thought he was, Howard replied with barely disguised satisfaction. Before becoming the respectable engineer you knew, Richard had a turbulent past. Certain acts that, even after so many years, could considerably tarnish his memory and affect your family if they were made public. I stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the image of my prudent and conservative Richard with this young revolutionary. Was it possible? Had he kept this part of his life hidden during all our years together? Are you blackmailing me? I finally asked, looking up to face them. Blackmail is such an unpleasant word, Carter replied with a cold smile. We prefer to see it as a mutually beneficial negotiation. You return what legitimately belongs to our family, and these unfortunate documents remain buried forever. My mind was working at full speed. I didn't care what Richard had done in his youth, during turbulent political years when many young people had been carried away by revolutionary ideals. But I perfectly understood how this information could affect our children, especially Michael, who held an important position at the Pentagon. I need time to think, I finally said, and to consult with my lawyer. Howard rose with a satisfied smile. Of course, dear. Take a couple of days. Here's my card. Call us when you're ready to discuss the terms of the transfer. They headed toward the door, but before leaving, Howard stopped and looked around once more. You know, this house holds many memories for our family. Some good, most not so much. I never understood why Richard wanted to come back here after everything that happened. What do you mean? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. His smile turned enigmatic. Ask the neighbors in town about the Bennet family and the tragedy of Magnolia Ridge. I guarantee it will be instructive. With those cryptic words, the three men left, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a feeling of unease I couldn't shake. As soon as their car disappeared down the road, I rushed to the phone and called Thomas Hamilton, Richard's lawyer. His secretary informed me he was in a meeting but would call me back as soon as possible. Then, hesitating for a moment, I dialed the number of my granddaughter Emma, Sarah's daughter, who had just finished law school. Grandma, she exclaimed joyfully when she answered. What a surprise! How are you? I'm fine, darling, I replied, trying to sound calmer than I felt. But I need your help. Could you come to an address I'm going to give you? It's important and I'd rather not talk about it over the phone. There was a brief silence. Of course, Grandma. You sound worried. Is everything okay? It will be when you get here, I assured her. Bring clothes for a couple of days. And Emma, don't mention this to your mother or your uncle for now, okay? After giving her the directions and hanging up, I sat on the sofa, exhausted by the tension of the encounter with the Bennets. My mind was buzzing with questions. Who were these men really? Was what they said about Richard's past true? And what was this tragedy Howard had alluded to? I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for answers. I took my car keys and headed to town. If the neighbors knew any stories about the Bennett family in Magnolia Ridge, it was time to discover them. The town was quiet in mid-morning. Some elderly people were taking the sun on benches in the square, while women chatted by the central fountain. I headed straight to the only bar I had seen upon entering the town. If there was a place where local stories and secrets were kept, it would be there. The Castle Bar was exactly what I expected. A rustic establishment with exposed wooden beams, a long zinc bar, and worn wooden tables. At that hour there were few customers. A couple of older men playing dominoes and the bartender cleaning glasses. I sat at the bar and ordered a coffee. The bartender, a robust man in his 50s with a thick mustache, looked at me curiously. "You're not from around here," he said, more a statement than a question as he served my coffee. "No," I admitted. "I'm staying at Magnolia Ridge." The effect was immediate. The bartender stopped cleaning, and the men playing dominoes interrupted their game, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and weariness. "Magnolia Ridge," repeated the bartender, lowering his voice. "That property has been closed for years. Only the man who bought it comes once in a while to do renovations." "That was my husband," I replied. "Richard Bennett. He passed away 2 years ago." The dominoes men exchanged glances, and one of them, the oldest, with a black cap and deep wrinkles that spoke of a lifetime under the sun, stood up and approached the bar. "You're Richard's wife?" he asked, studying me with eyes that still maintained surprising sharpness. "I'm George Miller. I knew the Bennett family all my life." "Evelyn Bennett," I introduced myself, extending my hand, which he shook firmly. "I'm trying to understand some things about the house and my husband's family." He never talked much about his past. George nodded slowly. "Doesn't surprise me. The Bennets were always reserved, especially after what happened." "And what exactly happened?" I asked, feeling I might finally get some answers. George looked at the bartender, who nodded and served us 2 glasses of brandy. "This isn't a story to tell with a dry throat," George explained, taking a sip. "It all began more than 50 years ago," he started. "The Bennett family was one of the most powerful in the region. Howard Sr., Richard and Howard's father, was a hard man, with important connections during the war years. They had land, influence, but they weren't loved. Howard Sr. treated his workers with cruelty, and his family not much better." George paused, lost in memories. "Richard and Howard were like day and night. Howard followed in his father's footsteps, cold and calculating. But Richard, he was different. Sensitive, kind, always with a book in his hands or drawing something. That drove his father crazy." "Drawing?" I interrupted. "Richard never told me he drew as a young man." "He was very good," George confirmed. "I remember seeing him in the square, drawing trees, people, anything. His mother encouraged him secretly, but Howard Sr. considered those hobbies as weaknesses." He took another sip of brandy before continuing. "When Richard was about 18, things changed. It was the late 60s, early 70s. Revolutionary ideas were reaching even towns like this. Richard began frequenting university circles in Boston, returning with prohibited books, new ideas, and then he met Hannah." "Hannah?" I repeated, feeling a strange pang of jealousy at the mention of another woman in my husband's life. "Hannah Reynolds," George nodded, "the town doctor's daughter. As idealistic as Richard, but braver, more determined. She introduced him to student groups that opposed the Vietnam War and supported civil rights. Those were dangerous times. The bartender, who had been listening in silence, intervened. My father told me there was a raid in Boston. Several students were arrested, including Richard. That's right, George confirmed. Howard Sr. used his connections to get him out of jail, but the price was high. Richard was sent here, to Magnolia Ridge, practically as a prisoner. And Hannah, he stopped, with a somber expression. What happened to her? I asked, dreading the answer. No one knows for certain, said George, lowering his voice. Officially, she had an accident on the highway. But there were rumors that it was a warning for those who opposed the government. My hand trembled, spilling some coffee. Was it possible that my Richard, my quiet and reserved husband, had lived through such a tragedy in his youth? The night Richard found out about Hannah's death, George continued, there was a terrible argument at Magnolia Ridge. The shouting could be heard all the way to town. And then, a fire. A fire? I repeated, remembering that Richard always had an irrational fear of fire. George nodded. It started in the east wing of the house. No one knows if it was accidental or something else. Howard Sr. got trapped. Howard Jr. managed to pull him out, but the old man suffered severe burns. Richard disappeared that same night. Many thought he had died in the fire, until years later rumors began to circulate that he was living in Boston, with a new identity, a new life. I sat in silence, absorbing all this information. It was as if they were talking about a stranger, not the man I had shared my life with for 4 decades. And the house? I finally asked. It was partially destroyed. Howard took over the property when his father died, but he never lived here. Too many bad memories, I suppose. It was a surprise to everyone when, about 10 years ago, Richard returned and bought the house. Do you know why he did it? I asked, desperate to understand. George shook his head. He never spoke to me, though I saw him several times in town. He seemed at peace, but determined. He hired workers from outside for the renovations, completely transformed the place. We remained silent for a moment, each lost in our thoughts. Finally, I dared to formulate the question that was haunting me. Do you think Richard had something to do with the fire? George looked at me directly, his eyes full of wisdom born of years. I'm not one to judge what happened that night. Those were dark times, and Richard had lost someone he loved. What I do know is that the man who returned decades later wasn't the same tormented young man. He had found peace somewhere. With me, I murmured. With me and our children. Then he must be grateful to you, George said with a kind smile. Now, if I may offer some advice, be careful with Howard and his sons. Howard Sr.'s ambition and cruelty didn't die with him. I thanked George for his story and the bartender for his patience, paid for the drinks, and returned to my car with my head spinning. The pieces were starting to fit. Richard's political past that the Bennetts had threatened to reveal, his aversion to talking about his family, his fear of fire, but many questions remained unanswered. Why had Richard returned to buy a house that held such painful memories? What secrets did Magnolia Ridge really hold? When I returned, Emma's car was already parked in front of the house. My granddaughter, a bright and determined young woman of 25 with the same dark hair as Richard, was waiting on the porch. When she saw me, she ran to hug me. Grandma, what is this place? When did you buy it? It's a long story, darling, I replied, hugging her tight. Let's go inside and I'll explain everything. Over the next few hours, I told Emma everything I had discovered. The house Richard had kept secret, the orchid paintings, the sanctuary for William, the visit from the Bennetts and their threats, and finally, the story George had shared with me at the bar. Emma listened attentively, occasionally taking notes in her notebook. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment, processing all the information. This is incredible, she finally said. Grandpa Richard always seemed so calm, so conventional. It's hard to imagine him as a young revolutionary. For me too, I admitted. I feel like I never really knew him. Emma took my hand. You did know him, Grandma. You knew the man he became, the man who loved you enough to create all this for you. She gestured at the room with its paintings. Maybe he didn't share his past, but he shared his future with you. Her words touched something deep inside me, and the tears I had been holding back finally overflowed. Emma hugged me as I cried, not just for the Richard I had lost, but also for the one I had never known. When I finally calmed down, Emma adopted a more professional expression. Now, regarding the Bennetts' threats, we need to review the property documentation and find out exactly what rights they have, if any. Thomas Hamilton, your grandfather's lawyer, must have all the documents, I said. I left him a message, but he hasn't called back yet. Good. That will be our first stop tomorrow, Emma decided. Meanwhile, we should search here. If Grandpa was as methodical as I remember, he must have kept copies of everything. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching the house, looking for any documents or clues Richard might have left. In his art studio we found boxes of supplies, sketches and studies for his paintings, but nothing related to the property. The library, though impressive, revealed no secret hiding places. We were about to give up when Emma noticed something strange in the master bedroom. Grandma, look at this, she said, pointing to the built-in closet. Don't you think the dimensions don't match the room? She was right. The closet was less deep than it should be given the size of the room. Carefully examining the back wall, Emma discovered a panel that moved slightly when pressed. With a satisfying click, it opened, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a modern safe. I looked at Emma in despair. How are we going to open it? She examined the lock, which required a 6-digit combination. We need a significant date. Grandpa's birthday? Your wedding anniversary? We tried several combinations without success. The date of our marriage, the birth of our children, even William's tragic birth. Nothing worked. It has to be something you would know, said Emma, frustrated. Something personal between you two. I stood thinking, trying to remember a date that might be significant to Richard. And then, like lightning, the answer came to me. His first painting, I murmured. The one in the living room, the first one he painted for me. I ran to the living room and examined the oldest painting. A small white orchid. In the bottom corner, next to the signature, was a date, 05/12/78. The day we met. I returned to the bedroom and entered the combination 051278. The safe opened with a soft hum. Inside we found exactly what we were looking for. A folder with all the legal documents of the property, including the original deed, the purchase receipts, the renovation permits, everything meticulously organized with triplicate copies. But that wasn't all. There was also a worn leather diary and a sealed envelope with my name. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope first. My dearest Evelyn, if you found this safe, it means you've discovered not only Magnolia Ridge, but also the secrets I've kept hidden during our life together. It was never my intention to deceive you, only to protect you and our children from a past I thought I had overcome. Howard has always coveted this property, not for its sentimental value, but for what it represents. Power, status, the Bennett legacy he believes he deserves. What he doesn't know is that I purchased this house legally. Our father in his final years was desperate for money due to bad investments and gambling debts. He sold me the property in secret with the condition that I never tell Howard. In this safe you'll find all the documents that prove your ownership, including my father's will and the payment receipts. You'll also find my diary, where I've recorded the true story of what happened that fateful night in night. If you choose to read it, you'll understand why I could never speak of my past. I trust you'll know what to do with this information. I've loved you every day of our life together, and that love is the only thing that was never a secret. Always yours, Richard. Emma and I looked at each other, overwhelmed by the discovery. The diary waited, promising to finally reveal the truth about that night of fire and flight that had forever changed Richard's life. Do you want to read it now? Emma asked softly. I shook my head. Later. First, we need to review these legal documents. Tomorrow we'll face the Bennets, and we must be prepared. We spent the next few hours meticulously examining each document. It was evident that Richard had been extremely careful. The purchase was legal and irrefutable, with all necessary signatures and seals. We also found a detailed report on the questionable financial activities of Howard and his sons, compiled by a private investigator. My Richard, always so methodical and foresighted, had prepared a legal arsenal to protect his legacy. That night, after Emma had retired to rest, I sat in the greenhouse, surrounded by the orchids Richard had cultivated with such love. With the diary in my lap, I took a deep breath and began to read the words my husband had written decades ago, finally revealing the truth about the night that changed his life forever. The diary began in 1970, when Richard was a university student in Boston. His writings confirmed what George had told me: his involvement in student movements against the Vietnam War, his romance with Hannah Reynolds, his arrest during a demonstration, and how his father had used his influence to get him out of jail, only to confine him at Magnolia Ridge, under constant surveillance. The pages described his desperation, his feeling of suffocation in that town, where every move was watched. And then, the tragedy: Hannah's death in a supposed car accident that Richard always suspected was something more sinister. The entry for July 15, 1972, was stained and wrinkled as if written under extreme emotion. Today, I discovered the truth. I found the letters that father exchanged with Captain Donovan about the Reynolds problem. It wasn't an accident. They killed her to teach me a lesson, to show me the price of rebellion. When I confronted father, he laughed. He laughed, said I should be grateful he rid me of a communist who would only bring me trouble. Howard was there, nodding as he always does, the perfect obedient son. I cannot continue living under the same roof as these monsters. The next entry, dated 3 days later, was brief and trembling. I've done something terrible. We argued again about Hannah. Father was drunk, crueler than ever. He hit me when I told him I had proof of his involvement. Then he threatened to burn the letters, the only evidence I had. We struggled. The oil lamp fell. The flames spread so fast. I tried to help him, but Howard pushed me away. The last thing I saw was my brother dragging father out of the burning room. I've taken some money and the letters. I can't stay. If they find me, they'll kill me, or worse, hand me over to the authorities. Tonight, Richard Bennett ceases to exist. The following pages recounted his escape to Canada and then to Europe, where he lived for several years with false documents, working odd jobs and studying engineering. Eventually, when the political situation in America changed with the end of the Vietnam War and the general amnesty, he was able to return with a new identity. That was when we met. I met someone today. Her name is Evelyn. She studies literature at the library where I work as an assistant. She has the kindest eyes I've ever seen, and a passion for orchids that reminds me of my mother. For the first time in years, I've felt something akin to hope. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I read how our love had blossomed, how Richard had found in our family the peace and purpose he sought. The final entries explained his decision to buy Magnolia Ridge. I've purchased the house. Father died last year, and Howard is desperate for money to maintain his lifestyle. He didn't recognize me when we met. The years in my beard were a good disguise. I offered him more than the property is currently worth, with the condition of absolute discretion. For him, it was just a convenient business deal with a stranger. For me, it's the opportunity to face my demons and transform a place of nightmare into something beautiful for Evelyn. This will be my final secret, my final project. Magnolia Ridge will no longer be a monument to fear and oppression, but a sanctuary of beauty and memories. Someday, when I'm gone, Evelyn will discover this place and understand why I could never speak of my past, and I hope she'll forgive me. I closed the diary, overwhelmed by the revelation. My quiet, reserved Richard had lived a life of secrets and pain that he never shared with me. He had been a victim, and in a way, also a perpetrator, caught in the violence of a dark time in our history. Did I judge him? I couldn't. Who knows how I would have reacted in his place? Young, desperate, having just lost the woman he loved to his own father's cruelty. What I did know was that the man with whom I shared my life had dedicated every day to creating beauty and love, as if trying to compensate for that moment of destruction. With this new understanding, I returned to the house, feeling a renewed determination. Howard and his sons would not take away Richard's last gift from me. Not after all he had suffered, not after all the beauty he had created from the ashes of his past. Tomorrow we would confront the Bennets, armed not only with legal documents, but also with the truth about the past, and I was sure that Richard, from wherever he might be, would be supporting us. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the sky wanted to compensate us for the emotional intensity of the previous days. Emma and I had an early breakfast, reviewing our strategy. We had decided to invite the Bennets to the house to discuss their demands, but on our terms. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Emma asked me as she reviewed the documents one last time. "We could simply send them a letter through a lawyer saying the property is legally yours and that they should stay away." "No," I replied firmly. "Howard has been running from the truth all his life. It's time he faces it, head to head." Just as we were finishing breakfast, my phone rang. It was Thomas Hamilton, finally returning my call. "Mrs. Bennet, I'm sorry I didn't call you back sooner. I was on a complicated case outside Boston." "Did you find the safe?" "Yes, Thomas. We found it. And we also found the Bennets." There was a brief silence. "Howard has appeared? Mr. Richard warned me this might happen. Have they caused you any trouble?" "Nothing we can't handle," I replied, feeling a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. "In fact, we've invited them over today for a little meeting." "What? Mrs. Bennet, I wouldn't recommend confronting them without legal representation. Howard Bennett is known for his aggressive business tactics." "Don't worry, I have my granddaughter Emma with me. She just finished law school, remember? Besides, we have all the documents Richard left in the safe." Thomas seemed relieved. "Good, that will help." Mr. Richard was extremely meticulous in ensuring the property was legally safe from any claim. "Still, be careful. Do you want me to come?" "Not necessary for now. But I'll keep you informed." After hanging up, Emma and I prepared the living room for the meeting. We arranged the documents on the dining room table, strategically ordered for our presentation. I also prepared coffee and some cookies, because as my mother always said, even battles are better fought on a full stomach. At 11 o'clock sharp, the sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the Bennets. The three men descended from their luxury car with the same arrogance they had shown the day before, though I could notice some surprise on their faces at seeing another car parked next to mine. Emma and I waited for them at the door. My granddaughter, dressed in a formal suit, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, projected an image of professionalism that clearly took them by surprise. "Good morning," I greeted with a calm I didn't feel. "Thank you for coming. Let me introduce my granddaughter, Emma Bennet. She's a lawyer, and is advising me on this matter." Howard assessed Emma with a dismissive look. "I didn't know we were coming to a formal meeting. I thought this would be a family conversation." "And it is," I replied, guiding them to the dining room. "A family conversation about legal matters. Please, take a seat." Once everyone was settled, I served coffee while Emma organized the documents in front of her. The atmosphere was charged with tension. "Yesterday, you implied that this property legitimately belongs to the Bennett family," I began, "and that my husband acquired it in a questionable manner. Is that correct?" Howard nodded smugly. "Magnolia Ridge has been Bennett property for generations. Richard took advantage of particular circumstances to inappropriately acquire it." "Interesting," said Emma, leaning forward. "Because we have documents that prove otherwise." She began to extract and present, one by one, the documents we had found in the safe: the original deed, the purchase contract signed by Howard Sr., the payment receipts, the bank transfers, all perfectly legal and in order. "As you can see," Emma continued in a professional tone, "my grandfather legally purchased this property from Howard Bennett Sr. on March 5th. The transaction was completely transparent and verified by a notary. There is no legal basis to question the ownership. Howard's expression subtly changed. But Carter, the older son, intervened with disdain. Documents can be falsified. And even if they were genuine, my grandfather was not in optimal mental condition in his final years. We could easily challenge the validity of the contract. We anticipated that possibility as well, Emma responded, extracting more documents. Here we have the medical evaluation of Howard Sr. conducted 2 weeks before the signing, certifying his full mental capacity. We also have sworn statements from 2 witnesses present during the negotiation and signing, plus the notary who validated the contract. All confirm that Howard Sr. acted with full knowledge and will. The 3 men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Their strategy was rapidly crumbling. But that's not all, I continued, taking control. We also found this. I placed on the table the envelope with the photographs and documents they had used to threaten me. Yes, I know about my husband's political past. What you don't know is that he also left this. I took out the letters Richard had mentioned in his diary, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Correspondence between Howard Bennett Sr. and Captain Donovan about the Reynolds problem. Direct evidence of your father's involvement in Hannah Reynolds' death. Howard visibly paled. That's slander. My father would never. Would never what, Howard? I interrupted him. Never order the death of a young woman because she represented a threat to his position? Never hit his own son for questioning his actions? Never caused so much pain that Richard preferred to disappear and start a new life rather than continue under his roof? The silence that followed was absolute. Edward, the youngest of the brothers, looked at his father and uncle with evident confusion. What is she talking about? He asked. Dad? Carter avoided his gaze, focusing on his coffee as if it contained the answers of the universe. Howard was the first to regain his composure. I see Richard told you his version of the story. He was always good at creating narratives that presented him as a victim. He didn't tell me anything, I replied calmly. That was his mistake, believing that secrets protect those we love. But I discovered the truth on my own. I read his diary. I spoke with people in town. I know what happened that night. I know about the fire, about how Richard fled, about how you and your father maintained the lie for decades. You know nothing, Howard snapped, his facade of elegance crumbling. You were just the foolish wife who never suspected she was married to a man who didn't even use his real name. A coward who ran instead of facing the consequences of his actions. What actions would those be? Asked Emma, maintaining a professional tone despite the growing tension. Opposing an oppressive regime? Discovering the truth about his girlfriend's death? Or perhaps you refer to the accident with the lamp, when he was trying to protect the only evidence he had about your father's involvement in a murder. Howard rose abruptly, his face contorted with anger. You have no right to judge things that happened before you were born. My father was a patriot, a man who did what was necessary to maintain order, and Richard almost killed him that night. Did you know that? He almost died from the burns. It was an accident, I replied firmly. A terrible accident during an argument. Richard tried to help him, but you pushed him away. And then what did your noble husband do? Howard continued with venom in his voice. He fled like a coward, leaving us to deal with the consequences. Leaving me to care for a half-dead father while he started a new life? Edward looked at his father and uncle with growing horror. What are you talking about? Uncle Richard tried to kill Grandpa. Why didn't you ever tell me this? Because it's not true, Emma intervened. My grandfather documented everything in his diary. It was an accident during a fight. He was defending himself after discovering his own father had ordered the murder of his girlfriend. Howard slammed his fist on the table. Lies! That Reynolds girl was an agitator, a threat. Her death was a traffic accident. Nothing more. I felt a strange calm wash over me as I observed Howard falling apart. This man, who had lived for decades nurturing his resentment, was now facing not only the truth, but also the consequences of his own lies. Richard spent the rest of his life trying to make up for what happened that night, I said softly. He built a family, helped others, and finally, created this place of beauty where once there was pain. What have you done, Howard? Besides feeding your hatred and lying to your own sons? Howard slumped back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. For a moment, I could see the young man he had been scared, trapped in the expectations of a cruel father, choosing family loyalty over justice. You'd never understand, he muttered. He escaped. I stayed. I was the one who carried everything. And now you want this house? I continued. Not because it means anything to you, but because it was important to him. Even now, after his death, you're still competing with your brother's ghost. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Edward looked visibly disturbed, while Carter maintained an impassive expression though his hands trembled slightly. Finally, Emma spoke in a professional tone. Let me clarify the legal situation. Magnolia Ridge legally belongs to my grandmother. Any attempt to dispute this property will fail in court, especially considering the abundance of documentation we possess. In addition, she added, sliding another folder across the table, we have detailed information about certain financial irregularities in your recent businesses. Information that, naturally, will remain confidential as long as any attempt to harass my grandmother or question her property rights ceases. Edward took the folder and briefly flipped through it, his eyes widening with each page. Father, this is— Give me that, Howard growled, snatching the folder from him. As he examined its contents, his face went from the red of anger to the pale of fear. This is blackmail, he finally said, closing the folder. I'd call it more of a mutually beneficial negotiation, I replied, using his own words from the previous visit. You leave us alone, and we don't make public what we know. Howard looked at Emma and me, with barely contained hatred. But I could see he had recognized his defeat. Let's go, he said to his son, standing up. We have nothing more to discuss here. As they headed toward the door, I called to him. Howard, he stopped without turning around. Richard always regretted what happened that night. He never forgave himself, but in the end, he found peace by transforming this place. Perhaps you can find it someday too. He didn't respond, but for a moment his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of decades of resentment had finally become too much to bear. Then he straightened up and left, followed by his sons. When the sound of their car disappeared in the distance, Emma and I looked at each other, and without a word, embraced. We did it, Grandma, she whispered. We beat them. No, I replied, thinking of Richard's diary, of his secret life, of the years of pain he never shared with me. There are no winners in stories like this, darling. Only survivors. In the days that followed, Emma returned to Boston to resolve some pending matters, promising to return soon. I stayed alone at Magnolia Ridge, exploring every corner, absorbing Richard's presence in every detail, every painting, every carefully cultivated orchid. I spent hours in the greenhouse, learning to care for the flowers he had loved, silently conversing with the small monument to our William. Some nights I slept in the master bedroom, others on the couch in the living room, surrounded by the paintings that told the story of a love that had transcended secrets and tragedies. A week after the confrontation with the Bennetts, as I was watering the orchids in the greenhouse, I heard the sound of a car in the driveway. My first thought was that Howard had returned, but as I looked out the window, I saw an unfamiliar vehicle, an elderly man, elegantly dressed, but with a simple air, descended with some difficulty. I hurried to the main entrance, curious and somewhat cautious. The man, in his 70s with white hair and kind eyes, waited patiently on the porch. Mrs. Evelyn Bennett? He asked, when I opened the door. Yes, that's me, I replied. How can I help you? The man smiled warmly. My name is Daniel Reynolds. I was Hannah's brother. My heart skipped a beat. The brother of the young woman Richard had loved before meeting me, the girl whose death had changed the course of his life. Please come in, I said, opening the door fully. It's an honor to meet you. I led him to the living room, where I served 2 cups of tea. Daniel observed the orchid paintings with evident appreciation. They're beautiful, he commented. Richard always had a talent for art. even when he was very young. Did you know him well? I asked, fascinated by this unexpected link to my husband's past. Daniel nodded. We were good friends before everything that happened. I was a bit older than them, but we shared ideals, dreams of a different country. His gaze was lost in memories. After Hannah's accident and Richard's disappearance, I left town. It was too painful to stay. How did you know I was here? I asked, offering him a cookie, which he accepted with a smile. George Miller called me. We've kept in touch over the years. He told me about your visit to town, about how you had discovered Magnolia Ridge and what had happened with Howard and his sons. He paused. He also told me that Richard had passed away. I'm very sorry. Thank you, I replied, feeling the familiar pain, but now mixed with a new understanding. He never told me about his past, about Hannah, about what happened here. Daniel nodded understandingly. Some pains are too deep to share, even with those we love most, especially with them perhaps, because we fear it will change the way they see us. Did you know he was still alive? That he had become another person? Daniel smiled sadly. I found out many years later. I ran into him by chance in Boston, in the early 90s. He was with a little girl, your daughter, I suppose. Sarah, I murmured, our older daughter. He saw me and knew I had recognized him. We met the next day at a cafe. He told me everything, his new life, his family, his work. He asked me to keep his secret, and I did. I owed him at least that. Why? I asked, intrigued. Daniel sighed deeply. Because the night Hannah died, she was supposed to meet me. I should have picked her up, but I had an emergency at the hospital where I worked. If I had been there, his voice broke. It wasn't your fault, I said, taking his hand. According to Richard's diary, Hannah's death was ordered by Howard Sr. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. Daniel squeezed my hand, grateful for the comfort, though we both knew some wounds never heal completely. I've come for another reason, besides meeting you, he said after a moment. Richard asked me to give you something if ever he was gone, and you discovered this place. He pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket. I've kept it all these years. With trembling hands, I took the envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph. A young Richard and a beautiful dark-haired girl, with a radiant smile, sitting in what appeared to be the town square. On the back, in Richard's youthful but recognizable handwriting, was written, Hannah and me, spring, 9. She was beautiful, I murmured, studying the happy face of the young woman who had been my husband's first love. She was, Daniel nodded. Not just on the outside. She had an inner light, a conviction that inspired everyone around her, including Richard. We sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the photograph and all it represented: truncated lives, altered paths, loves lost and found. You know, Daniel finally said, for years I wondered why Richard came back to buy this house. It seemed a strange decision, returning to a place of so much pain. I wondered that too, I admitted. But I think I understand now. He wasn't returning to the past. He was transforming it, turning a place of darkness into one of light. Daniel nodded, looking again at the orchid paintings. Like these paintings. Beauty created from pain. He rose slowly. I should go. I have a long drive back to Vermont. Could you come back sometime? I asked impulsively. I'd like you to meet my children, my grandchildren. I think they'd like to know more about this part of their father's and grandfather's story. Daniel smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. I'd love that, Evelyn. It would be an honor. We said goodbye on the porch, promising to keep in touch. As his car drove away, I felt as if another piece of the complex puzzle that had been Richard's life had finally found its place. That night, sitting in the greenhouse under the silvery moonlight, filtering through the glass roof, I made a decision. Magnolia Ridge would not just be a personal refuge or a private memorial. It would be something more, something that honored both the past and the future. In the months that followed, with the help of Emma and my other grandchildren, I transformed part of the property into a small art and conservation center. Richard's studio became a space where local artists could create and exhibit their work. The greenhouse, expanded and renovated, was opened as a botanical garden, specializing in endangered orchid species. The main section of the house remained my private home. But on weekends, the room with Richard's paintings opened as a small gallery. Visitors came to admire the talent of an unknown artist who had secretly created beauty, inspired by love. I never publicly revealed the true story of Richard Bennett. That part of his legacy remained private, shared only with our family, and with people like Daniel Reynolds, who had been part of that earlier life. For the outside world, the paintings and garden were simply the work of a man who had found his calling late in life, a retired engineer who discovered his passion for art and nature. Howard and his sons never returned to Magnolia Ridge, at least not while I was there. But a year after our confrontation, I received a letter from Edward, the youngest. He wrote to apologize for his participation in the attempt to take the property from me, and to share that he had distanced himself from his father and brother. The revelation of the family secrets had led him to question many things. He ended his letter asking if someday he could visit the art center, not as a Bennett claiming a right, but as someone interested in knowing his uncle's artistic legacy. I replied inviting him to come whenever he wanted, and months later, he appeared alone, shy but genuinely interested. He spent hours contemplating Richard's paintings, recognizing in them a talent that his own family had never valued. Before leaving, he handed me a small box. "I found this among my grandfather's things," he explained. "I think it belongs here." Inside the box was an old silver pocket watch with a delicate orchid engraved on the lid. Opening it, I discovered an inscription inside. "For Richard, there will always be time for beauty. With love, Mom." Richard's mother gave it to him on his 16th birthday, Edward told me. She was the only person in the family who understood his sensitivity, his love for art. She died when he was 17. After that, everything changed for him. That night, I placed the watch next to the small monument to William, in the greenhouse, thus uniting the invisible threads that connected past with present, losses with discoveries, pain with beauty. Over the years, Magnolia Ridge became more than just a place. It was a symbol of transformation, a testament to how love can turn even the most painful memories into something beautiful. Richard's secrets, which once seemed like a betrayal to me, I now understood as acts of protection, and finally as gifts. Each morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the dew sparkle on the magnolias that gave the property its name, I felt his presence, not as a ghost trapped in the past, but as a continuity, a love that had transcended time, lies, and even death. And at night, when the wind whispered among the trees and the orchids in the greenhouse unfolded their colors under the moonlight, I could almost hear him telling me what he had written in his last letter. "I have loved you every day of our life together." And that love is the only thing that was never a secret. Magnolia Ridge held many secrets, but the most important one was the one I had discovered, that even lives built on silences and omissions can be filled with true and deep love, that sometimes what isn't said is as important as what is shared, and that some secrets, when finally brought to light, don't destroy but liberate. Now, at 80 years old, I continue to live in this magical place that Richard created for me, surrounded by his paintings, his flowers, and the memories we built together, both those I knew during our shared life and those I discovered afterwards. And each day I thank the curiosity that led me to break that promise and visit Magnolia Ridge, because in doing so, I not only discovered Richard's secrets, but also a new version of myself, stronger, wiser, and above all, more capable of understanding the complex nature of true love. Because true love is found not only in what we reveal, but also in what we choose to protect, not only in the words said, but in the silences shared, not only in moments of joy, but in how we transform our pain together. And that, perhaps, is the most valuable lesson Magnolia Ridge had to teach me. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, Share it with someone special. Leave us a comment about what you felt. And subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories. Because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.